Hey, what's up, guys? Today we're going to be talking about music licensing. I wanted to give you an overview and just give you like a vision for what music licensing is, how it works, and essentially how you can make money licensing your music. So let's take a look. Overall, we're gonna go through a few things about this, but music licensing is the function that generates capital from owned and copyrighted content. And so, first off, the licensing process really comes down to ownership. So whoever owns the work has the ability to license the work, and a license essentially instead of buying something and having ownership of it, is a means of basically letting somebody lease certain elements of it for a period of time. And so those periods of time could be infinite, or they could have certain limitations. And what's great about licensing is that licensing can be done over and over and over again, depending on the terms and the relationship. And so there are no real boundaries to the limit of money that can be made with the licensing if the licensing is done cleverly. So for a single work, a single song could be licensed across multiple spans. So let's talk about that real quick. First, let's start off by taking a look at this real fast. And if we just kind of keep this idea in mind of the ownership, basically whoever owns the copyright has the ability to distribute it in a lot of different ways, but they also have the ability to license it in all these other lanes. And so, you know, we could license to TV, we could license to film, we could license to any kind of sponsorship deal that we'd like. So if we have some sort of sponsorship that we'd like to see take place, you know, like let's say we make a deal with Adidas, we could license the music to Adidas for a number of things, whether it's TV related or online, you know, YouTube, social media. We have all these avenues of licensing. And because of that, you know, what it allows us to do is it allows us to take one work and span out its ability to make money into this giant orchestrated element. The downside to this is that it takes somebody to know how to do that. And let's start by really talking about the things that have to go into that, because it's not as easy as it sounds, but it brings value to the work itself. So the owners of the copyright issue the license and can have thousands of active licenses, and licensing happens daily and in every point of exchange from one person to another. You know, purchasing music, streaming music, syncing music. So there's a license that actually applies when music is being distributed. So the license agreement when music is being distributed typically is, you know, if we're putting it on Spotify, we have some sort of performance license for that work, and Spotify is allowed to make money off of it, but we're making an agreement where we actually allow our music to be on that platform, but we have the ability to pull it down at specific times, and then we can move it to other platforms as well, and we're not exclusive. Each license type is different and has specific limitations. Now, as we look at that, actually, I don't remember if I wrote much of the limitations down in these slides. Oh yeah, there's no limitation listing here. So let's actually take a look at that, because that, I think, is a great immediate thing to think about. So there are limitations with how the license can be used, and so if we kind of like start with this idea that you know, a license could have a term. It could be exclusive for that term. And of course, it could be non-exclusive. And those are definitely the best ones, but there's some basic ideas there. If the term is shorter or longer, it will allow us to either make more or less money off of that license. So typically, if the license is going to be for a longer term, we're going to try to bring in more earnings off of that license. So the term being short could be okay as long as we have multiple licenses running. You know, and so as just an example, as a general example, let's say the song is licensed for some sort of sync on a TV commercial. For a TV commercial, the term is usually going to be a specific mid set of time, maybe a couple of years, and that may actually fall into this exclusive area because they're not going to want to see multiple commercials using your music within the same cycle of that commercial. So if the commercial has a lifespan of about 1 year that it's going to run, they usually extend that exclusive term just a bit beyond that so that people have time to kind of forget that that song was on there before it can be reused again. And so that offers the opportunity to make more money. And then, of course, it offers this exclusive lock-in. So that means that that song might be locked out of being able to be in any kind of deal that looks like that for a while. But if we look at some other types of terms and uses on a non-exclusive that are great, this is, kind of an easy one here is like cover songs. If someone wants to do a cover of your song, instead of having it be exclusive, those are non-exclusive terms. They're going to license it, and they're going to license it for a flat fee that might be small. It might even be smaller than this because of how many people are doing it. But then if you take that term and you say, well, it's a smaller fee and it's a non-exclusive, the great news about that is you want to be able to target multiples. You want to essentially have multiple licenses of that same system running out there in order to fill that in. Because obviously at a lower rate, we can make a larger amount of money, but only if we have the volume. So, things like cover songs, using the license to cover the song, or even utilizing YouTube videos. So we're, instead of making the music something that's like as a part of a sponsorship deal or a part of a TV engagement, maybe it's just music for YouTube. So this is where things like sound libraries come in, or I should say sound and music libraries come in, because if you're going to make let's say you make just, some sort of drum, bass, and guitar riff. It's just some instrumental. It's a 30-second spot. And you start making a bunch of those, generating a bunch of those. You can work either with existing libraries or you can build your own library and start to sign off on non-exclusive terms for people to use them for simple stuff like YouTube videos or maybe just internal videos. And then you charge them a very low fee, almost next to nothing, to the degree that you can pick up the volume for it to make it make sense. And so that kind of puts you in that lane. So let's now talk about the kind of licenses that are out there. Now, there's different types of licenses. There's different modifications to these licenses too. So I would think that I would suggest that anything under the sun has a means of being licensed, meaning there's any combination of ways that you could license music. But the majority of the time, we're looking at things like performance licenses, mechanical licenses, print, sync, master use, and compulsory. And we're going to identify and work through those real quick. In looking at those elements, we just talked about exclusivity, but the ownership becomes key. Who owns it and how? Because I think the biggest thing that I see in ownership land is this. When you have a group of individuals or organizations that all share the rights to the copyright, everybody has to agree on its use. And if any one person is like, nope, then the deal or the license oftentimes gets shut down or just gets denied. Now, one way to alleviate that when you have a multi-group situation is to say, well, instead of having everybody even have a vote necessarily, let's just do a blanket license setup where everybody just signs off on uses that look like this. So maybe everybody signs off on anything sync, and they kind of they basically pre-approve it. So when the deal comes through, instead of having to have organizations, look at that, or even anybody internally go, does everybody agree with the use? Instead, they go, well, we already have this document that's already set up for this, and everybody opted in to always agree to any deals that look like the following, so it's automatically approved, and then therefore we can just get the ball rolling and start the actual like cycle of utilizing that license and getting it out there and then getting money funneled back in. So there's one way to alleviate that quite a bit. The license term, of course, becomes important. I think one of the biggest things that I find valuable is evaluating the time that you're going to lose it versus the money that's being brought in. And so, you know, if you bring it in and say, well, let's take a look at that and say, well, you know, what is the time versus the amount? Okay, so like this being the money over that period of time, because all of that money is typically paid up front. So meaning like whatever that money is all being really paid here all in one shot. But if it's not enough to make it valuable to have that thing locked in over a certain duration of time, then oftentimes it becomes imbalanced and you actually box yourself out of great opportunities. So one of the big things that I talk about with new artists or artists that just have stuff that's just recently coming out and they just haven't established it yet is don't lock it all into licensing up front in these exclusive long-term, you know, so don't sign on to the first license opportunities that you necessarily get if they're long-term and they're exclusive, because your one song, this could represent just one song, and once that's locked in, it might actually look like this. Part of licensing that you're really hoping for is not just time and not just money, but you also want visibility. And so if you have your time and your money, but there's visibility, then it's worth it. But let's just say, you know, it was a little bit more like this. Money wasn't great, time duration was long, but with if it's not visible, meaning like we just signed on to a deal that set us up that did short segments on YouTube that nobody ever watched. Then obviously, you know, that cashing out at such a soon element boxes us out of actually having something that might have paid more, that might have been more visible, and had provided really what the goal of the sync license might be, or any license is. The goal of any license is to drive sales. So like the reason why we license it's not just to make the money today, it's to set up a license that allows for more money tomorrow. And so in order to get that done, we have to make sure that we have, you know, visibility that's applied to it. So, you know, it's not like someone's just licensing it to do something internal and then they box it out of ever being seen by the public. So that's why like the best license deals oftentimes tend to be either sponsorships or with commercials or things that are going to be on film and TV. Things that people can come around and look at. And what I like to say is like anytime you're doing any kind of deal, it's best, of course, if there's more than one strategy being applied in terms of how you can gain and move forward as an artist. Meaning, like, is it just financial? Is it visibility? Is it a sense of validity? Meaning, like, oh, as soon as you got, you know, a deal with a real company, you all of a sudden became a legitimate artist. Whereas, you know, maybe you signed, you know, some sort of deal with a film, but it's only going to be seen at film festivals, and it's not really going to be out there with the major public. Well, you know, you haven't necessarily yet established that level, and so like we're really trying to lock in things that really get us to that. The other thing is how the royalties are used, and we're going to take a look at that, and then the reporting and accounting. And so one of the big things that we have to look ahead to is I always say don't do anything unless it's going to make money, unless you really just mean to do it for fun. Otherwise, if it's meant to make money, it has to have dollar signs in the plan, and how are they distributed and where do they come from. And so the royalty type is actually going to be based upon what type of sync. Okay, so it's whatever type of sync we're going to use is going to bring in certain levels and certain types of royalties. And so we have to have some expectation of that. We have to know what to expect. And we don't want to blindly go into anything that includes royalties if we have no idea what that is. Okay, so we have to have some sort of expectation. The reason I mention that is because licensing pays out typically in two ways. Licensing can pay out in either one, upfront, or two, in royalties, or if you're fortunate enough, both. So this is an and or, and you really want, if you're able to secure the biggest priority, I would say, is definitely this. And the reason why is because if it's up front, you know what to expect. You know whether or not you want to sign a long-term deal or an exclusive deal if you know what the upfront is. If you don't know what the upfront is, and the only thing you're relying on is just royalties that happen on the back end, or maybe as a result of, it's really hard to put your finger on whether or not this is a good deal or not. So having a balance of both makes it make sense. We have to talk about, again, though, going back to that, what those royalties are is going to be set up by what type of license we sign. So we're going to talk about that in a moment. The last part is that anytime there's money, we have to ask who is responsible, right? Who is responsible for paying out the money that comes in, and who's responsible for collecting the money that comes in? What is the money that's coming in or going out, and when is it supposed to be coming and going? It's like, when is, so they get like, I always think it's an important thing. Like, if I said, listen, I'm going to give you $1 million. If I say I'm going to give you $1 million, that sounds great, but the devil is in the details of when. And I said, well, I will deliver it to your account the day after you die. Well, that's not a valuable location to have it, right? Or if I said, you know what, I will pay you $1 million spread over the next 70 years. If you do the math on that, that's, it gets distributed in a poor way. And so it's a matter of when is that payment actually going to be received by whoever is supposed to be receiving it, or who has earned it through that process. And so we have to look at, okay, well, who's doing the reporting? Who's doing the accounting? Is there even a way for us to audit the accounting if it's being handled by a third party? So we just have to mind the P's and Q's there, because I wish I could say it's just a whirlwind of happiness and joy and financial bliss, but as most of us know, a lot of stuff gets lost in the process or in transition, and things fall through the cracks unknowingly when we're not being adamant about understanding the reporting and the accounting. So our first type of license that we really want to talk about is the license for broadcast via radio, TV, and streaming. This essentially is called the performance license. Anytime that you typically hear the word performance, as it refers to a recorded composition, we typically think about the actual push and play. So anytime the recording is being played, commonly confused with a license to live perform a song, this one is the license to just push play. And the common way to tell which one we're really talking about in the deal is we have to focus on which circle C is part of the license, because if it's PA, the PA is the actual composition, meaning just the ideas. The musical notes, each phrase, line by line lyrics, all that kind of stuff, but it doesn't speak to who, when, and where that's actually happening. And so the PA gets licensed in a lot of ways when we're licensing it as a cover, or we're licensing it as a sample. But the SR, which is the sound recording, this one is the one that is usually the one we're trying to sell in terms of licensing for radio, TV, and film and streaming, because it's already recorded. We're not trying to get somebody else to come back through and re-record it or whatever. We're just selling that original recording or licensing that original recording. And so that is where, when we're talking performance, we're talking typically the SR part of that copyright. Now, what makes this tough is, as I mentioned before, when I was talking about having all parties agree, now all of a sudden there's a difference between the SR parties and the PA parties. They can absolutely be different. Normally the SR is owned by whoever funded the record, and the PA is owned by the original writers. And so, if we look at it that way, the PA typically has a larger team, but the SR has stronger actual business entities. So these could be owned by a label, these could be brought in so many other different ways, or they could have ownership spanned across just multiple artist agencies, and so just depending on who is responsible for all that makes a big difference in how we get the performance license agreed upon and moved forward. So in a performance license, again, because we're talking the SR, we are almost a lot of times when we're talking the performance license, we are seeing strong back-end royalties, and we're seeing stronger back-end versus front, and so the balance leans more this way oftentimes than this way. And the reason why is because if we look at this list, radio, TV, streaming, film, not film, but film when it goes to TV, all of those things are PRO related, and the performance rights organizations collect, and those royalties, you'll see heavier numbers on that side, where like for streaming, we do make money on the front end for streaming, and that essentially is the mechanical. But the license terms that we sign to for that performance license will outline what that mechanical is. If we're going to TV, that mechanical is a little bit different in terms of how it's being utilized, and when it's being utilized. And so that brings us to the mechanical overall. So the mechanical license grants the rights to reproduce and distribute musical compositions. Back in the day, the mechanical was a big focus on CDs, tapes, records, something that had a physical medium. Nowadays, we think about it more often with downloads, interactive streams, and any other configuration, including locker-based music services and bundled music. And so what that means is like if for some reason in some way your music is bundled with a group of artists or that are doing something. So like let's say you even just signed on to a soundtrack and your mechanical was built into that grouping, essentially you'd have this style of mechanical license that you'd see. These are most commonly seen at point of sale. So a lot of times, like when I tried to promote mechanical, like the way that I kind of envision this and just make it easier for people to understand, you think of the mechanical license as something that has to physically move. You know what I mean? Like it's a spinning wheel. It's, you know what I mean? Like it's something that has to physically move. So that mechanical license typically ends up being, a stream, or a download. And you think of it in that way, it'll kind of help you keep that straight. Going back to that idea, what we'll see in a moment, is those license types get you to royalty types. So, of course, mechanical license requires mechanical fees, therefore produces mechanical royalties. And that brings us to print licensing. So this one's kind of interesting. The print license is typically a blanketed license agreement for print arrangements. It allows for the manipulation of alternative arrangements in the part or in the whole of the entire work. But what I mean by blanket license a lot of times is like you're going to sign off on a print license, with Mel Bay, and they're just going to say, all right, well, it has this flat amount, or it has a rate, and you sign off on that rate, and they're going to do a gazillion versions of that work. Every arrangement known to man, they're going to combine, flute with oboe and oboe with timpani, and they're going to do every, tuning of, trumpet and strings and anything you can think of, like the wackiest combinations. And a print license allows it to have the freedom for them to build those utilizing this flat rate, and then they monetize that element and provide the fees. And so what a print license will often do is have a certain percentage up front. So again, looking at front versus back, a certain percentage of the upfront, and then a certain percentage and rate for the back. So like as things sell, you'll see those numbers change, but you'll have like this upfront percentage that makes sense, and it could be very minimal, especially with print license the way that it is. The other thing that we have to look at then is the sync license. So the sync license is kind of like, honestly, it's the shiny license type. Everybody gravitates towards sync. It's a great buzzword. Licensing for synchronization with video, film, game. A lot of people, though, kind of think about film and video, TV commercials. They think about being a jingle or, somebody's soundtrack for their TV show. But a lot of people kind of don't really think as much about game, but game is a hot industry, and so game has a lot of opportunity in terms of licensing for synchronization. The difference is that it pays an upfront fee, and it's typically a one-time payment that they pay, and then the PROs will pay out anything that comes through royalties on the back end, because the stations have to pay those particular royalty rates based upon whatever they're playing. And so, there's an upfront, and then there's a possible back. And so with game, it's not as heavy on the back end because, the platforms that it's seen on or visible on are not as noticeable. But gamers still load their content to YouTube, which means there are still streams of a soundtrack or audio or things that might be on there. But I think one important thing to think about is there is a difference between sync and composition. And what I mean by that is, like, if you're signing a sync deal, the music is already recorded typically, and it has no affiliation to the media itself. Like, the director didn't ask for it typically, or there are times, that a director will make a sync deal with an artist beforehand, and then there's a plan to, but typically the music is already built, and it's not like the director's in the recording studio listening to yes, this, not that. Oftentimes, content is already recorded. It's recorded either by the artist or the label. This is already recorded, and the artist maintains ownership. It's funded up front. And they're going to cut it in different ways. They might reassemble it or only use certain portions of the vocals throughout, the work. They're going to use it how they see fit. And the terms of that agreement are going to allow them to have the freedom to do that. But, if you were composing for that film, the difference is that, all that recording and all that stuff essentially is part of a production plan. And it's getting signed off by a bunch of people that are part of that pipeline. Most of all, the director. So a lot of times the work is being drafted, sent to the director. The director is going to review it and go yes or no. We move forward. It's going to have a lot of revisions. So it's very revision heavy. And at the end of the day, it's owned by either the director or the film house that put it together. So like if it's a Universal film, it's going to be owned by Universal. And what that ends up meaning is that it's also funded up front, which is good, but it means that between these two, the back end percentages, the percentages are higher with sync, and they may be very minimal to nothing with composing, depending on what the situation is. There are definitely limitations to how that works. So that's not just a, I hate to make that a blanket statement, but because it really is specific to the case. The master use license is the most expansive. This license is typically signed during a recording deal or a publishing deal and encompasses all license types for the exploitation of the work, which means they're going to use what a master use license really gives anybody to do is when they're owning a work or when they sign it, and we take over this work, as soon as signatures were signed on this deal, we literally have the ability to do whatever we want with it without having to go through approval process. So master use puts us anywhere. We get to go use it anywhere at all times. It is owned. A lot of times that master use is going to be exclusive, so it'll hold and stick with us. And we can use it in lots of different ways. Master use licenses, of course, are bigger deals. So like if you're signing a master use, you're expecting the big dollars for this. You're not just giving that one away. So that's a big piece to that. And then lastly, the compulsory. The compulsory, out of all the types, every one of these types was a type. The compulsory is a little bit. It's still a type of license, but it's a little bit more. It could still fall under certain categories of licensing. This license allows for the re-recording of the performance of a work that has already been released to the public that does not require advance permission by the copyright owner. It does require timely notification within 30 days of the intent to release, and it pays the highest statutory license rate. So what happens with the compulsory is the compulsory license is basically one artist released a song out to the world, and another artist wants to do the same. And there's two ways where they can do it. They can negotiate it and go back and forth on a rate. Or the artist can basically just say, all right, I'm taking it. And I don't really care what anybody says about it. But they have to notify the original artist that is taking place. But they're also going to pay more money for that use. And it's kind of like, to be honest, it's a little bit more courtesy based in that it makes for a dialogue that happens between these parties about what the possibilities are, what it's going to look like, what it's going to feel like, what they would suggest. Thoughts. So a lot of times it could be conversational about that, and sometimes it might even include a cameo in the music video from the original artist, stuff like that, and we make a relationship that might actually improve or benefit the use of this work. This isn't normally how songs are either covered or used, but it is a method when somebody wants to get at it. Sometimes the compulsory is. It's something that has to be done even between an artist that's a group that broke up that wants to have rights or access to part of licensing some of it without having to get the full permission of everybody else. But then again, they still have to notify them and they have to pay them, and it creates a lot of legal issues if they don't follow through with that effectively. And that, of course, happens. That's one of those things that is kind of a sticky situation. Above all, with licensing in mind, licensing, we just have to remember that the goal of licensing is to grow that amount of money. We really want that. We really want to take the work and the artist wisely through a licensing process that allows them to have more visibility. And I think, from my perspective, there's a couple license types that I love, especially when I hear them. Probably one of my favorite license types that I'm a huge fan of when I kind of look at these and kind of look at that perspective is anytime you're getting licensed for a sports station. Let's say you're getting a license deal with Fox Sports or NBC, and what that license type would entail is the use of the music at the arena, the use of the music on TV, and I think that's probably one of my favorite license types when I'm sitting there watching football and all of a sudden I hear a song that I like that's being licensed, and it's being, run over top of the programming for that game. That's a great medium because you're broadcasting already, like meaning it's being sent out to the masses, and then you're reaching a demographic that might be a good fit for you, so that their natural intention or their natural response might be to go, oh, I like this song. What is it again? And they might either Shazam it, or they might look it up if they already know it. What it really does is it starts to instill the idea of that song into them. So by the time they actually hear it, around for a while, they hear it for a couple weeks, it's just one of those things that is already in their brain. It's like so familiar that they love it. They're not fighting against it, and I think that's a great model for how we should be using our licensing. Licensing is really promotion. Licensing, it makes money, and it can make really good money as you elevate, but it really is its biggest goal is to get the music out there in a platform that validates the artist. And again, if you were to get that on TV anywhere, especially, that really highly validates an artist, and all of a sudden people start to pay attention, and it really creates the storyline for where that artist is going in their career. And that's it on licensing.